and welcome to another political profile that I've done for the Astro Insights blog. I had a lot of good feedback after the profile I did on Liz Truss a couple of weeks ago, and so I thought I would do another profile kind of in a similar vein of the new Chancellor of the Exchequer here in the UK, Jeremy Hunt. He's an interesting guy. I've kind of had my eye sort of following his career for quite a few years now. I think mainly since the leadership bid back in 2019, when he went head-to-head against Boris Johnson for the position of leader of the Tory party. And I was very struck by his human design, and I thought he was somebody who was like one of those hidden contenders, like a bit of a dark horse. So I thought, now that he's kind of back in the spotlight, I would delve a little bit into his chart, because the Tory party, and certainly in UK politics and the economies, is at a bit of a pivot point, and he often gets called in during crises to sort of fix things. So I thought perfect time to just sort of have a look at his profile and find out a little bit more about who exactly the politician called Jeremy Hunt is. The man, and the sort of the persona. So let's dive in and have a look, and hopefully you'll find this of interest. So before we dive into the astrology and the human design, I thought I would just kind of give you a little bit of background in case you weren't sort of aware of him. But he's actually the son of an admiral of the Royal Navy, Sir Nicholas Hunt. So he comes from a military family. He's been the MP for South West Surrey, which is kind of considered to be the banker's belt, since about 2005, when he was elected as part of the Cameron-led government. So he's sort of jokingly referred to as one of the Cameroons, and they were considered to be sort of like one nation conservatives, or conservatives who were very much interested in like what they call compassionate conservatism, which we'll get into in a minute. But they were sort of like seen as like the reformers of the Tory party, that would sort of bring more of the kind of the liberal kind of soft qualities associated with conservatism, and rather than the sort of the more harsh sort of aspects of that particular movement, of the conservative movement. Essentially he was rewarded for his loyalty to David Cameron with shadow cabinet positions after supporting Cameron in his leadership campaign. Prior to entering politics, though, he was an English teacher. Actually, he taught in Japan, and also a tech entrepreneur. So he set up like an online education publishing company called Hot Courses, which I suppose it was kind of before its time in a lot of respects. Now people are very kind of comfortable with the idea of doing courses online, but I think at that stage it was still very early. However, I mean, he's still pretty successful. I think he sold it later for about £17 million. So I mean, he didn't do too badly from the whole thing. And so it's interesting now that he's for the first time coming into a position that has to do with kind of business and finance. Prior to this, most of his cabinet positions, certainly once the Conservatives got into government, which was only in 2010, so up until that point he was part of what they call the shadow cabinet, so in the opposition, the position of the party of opposition. So prior to sort of once he got into government, or once the Conservatives got into government, he was Secretary of State for Culture, Olympics, Media and Sport from 2020 to 2012. So he oversaw the Olympics. And he was also, interestingly, you'll see this as kind of like a hallmark of his, of many of his positions, that he kind of weathers crises. So during this time, he successfully delivers the Olympics, although there were some sort of gaffes along the way. And then he also steered through a controversy about the B-Sky-B bid. A lot of people thought that he was consorting with the Murdochs, when this turned out not to be the case. And he also kind of he was in this position of Minister for Culture, Media and Sport during the Leveson inquiry, which was of course huge. This was kind of the whole media hacking, the press hacking, phone hacking scandal, and that sort of thing. And so that was 2010 to 2012. Then for the next sort of 6 years or so, he became Secretary of State for Health, the longest serving health minister that the Tories have ever had. And here he presided over quite a lot of reforms to the NHS during a very difficult time. This was kind of from 2012 onwards, or from 2010 onwards, certainly there was this kind of program of austerity after 2008. And so he had to oversee a lot of budget cuts within the NHS, which wasn't very easy. And it led to a bit of a standoff with junior doctors over pay and hours, because he changed their employment contracts so that they would have to work weekends for pretty much the same pay as during the week, with this idea of like shift work. And a lot of doctors still bear a lot of resentment towards him for this. But it's interesting, if you kind of listen to interviews and things, the one thing that for him was really important was putting patients like centre and sort of front and centre. And I think there's a story of how when he went into his job, he learned that there was a sort of a 10%. This is kind of like an unofficial figure, but it's sort of like an open secret within medicine, certain allopathic medicine, that 10% of patients will be harmed through the care that they receive. And he was horrified when he heard this, and he wanted to put patient safety at kind of the center of what he managed to do in terms of introducing reforms or kind of greater levels of care to ensure that people were not unnecessarily dying or being harmed as a result of things like, like there was that story about the nurse who was killing children with insulin, or, and also sort of things like unforeseen, not necessarily malpractice, but unforeseen accidents, or kind of like neglect through maybe not sort of good procedures, or just sort of negligence on some level. And he before he came back into government now, he had vowed, I think after he left, certainly after 2018, he vowed that he would write a book about this idea of patient safety, and he has actually just written that book. It's called Zero. So somebody who cares passionately about helping people, ordinary people, and I think that's why he talks a lot about compassionate conservatism, that he sees this as being one of the reasons why he went into politics, is to make a difference to everyday people's lives. So he really believes in this idea of kind of service. And I think it's something that he's repeated a lot since he's kind of come back into the current position, and I think was exactly what was needed after the sort of the seemingly cavalier attitude of Kwasi Kwarteng, and this idea that the boys club of the bankers and that sort of thing must come first, and never mind ordinary people, even though they're kind of going through a cost of living crisis. So a very different tone he's already kind of setting as far as all of that is concerned. So anyway, after that, he was Secretary of State for foreign affairs, so for the Foreign Affairs Department, and he replaced Boris after he became Prime Minister. So he lost to Boris in 2019 in the leadership race, and essentially had to repair all the gaffes that had been made by his predecessor. I mean, Boris was not the most responsible or kind of tactful when it came to a lot of his comments. I mean, there was some comment about pickaninnies, and he also said something about people being, I think, Muslim women being like post boxes, when they're kind of wearing their veil and their hijab, and then he also made some terrible gaffes around Nazanin Zaghari Ratcliffe. And I mean, it's interesting now that she's kind of come back into the sort of the public sphere with what's going on in Iran, because she was eventually released. But essentially he made her situation worse because he sort of propagated falsehoods about her, not intentionally, but just through sheer carelessness and tactlessness, which essentially meant that she got held longer by the Iranian government because they thought she was some kind of spy, even though she was actually just there visiting relatives on holiday. So, as I say, interesting that in almost all of his roles, he's not had an easy ride. He's had to sort of weather some quite big crises, and has not really shied away from that job, even though, as I say, he he wasn't always popular. And it's interesting because we'll see this later on, that he's certainly not somebody who believes in doing what's popular. Unlike Boris Johnson, he's more interested in doing what he feels is right. So anyway, coming back to this idea of compassionate conservatism, which we'll hear a lot about, which was kind of the central tenor of the David Cameron years, was this idea of compassion, but not the same as the kind of the left, which tends to sort of have a slightly more socialist sort of overtone of kind of community and working together, and people at the bottom not being sort of seen like persecuted necessarily. So the whole kind of the welfare state is sort of like predicated on socialist principles. But this idea of compassionate conservatism actually started in America, but it was interpreted slightly differently by the conservatives here in the UK. So he, in one interview, said the conservative idea of compassion is different from the left's. It's more hard-edged, because we understand that you need to confront difficult reforms if you're really going to raise standards in public services, in education, healthcare, or policing. We're prepared to make those difficult choices. In other words, it's a kind of it's an agreement where both parties, both the person that you're helping or the institution that you're helping, and the government take equal responsibility for what happens. So it's not charity. It's kind of it's aid, but the other parties also need to sort of come to the table, do their bit, that kind of thing. But I mean, you'll see that it can be traced back to the Conservative Party under David Cameron. And if you think back to his election speeches, I mean, some of them are a little bit cringeworthy now. There's a whole idea of like hug a hoodie and that kind of thing, to do with like teenage thuggery and trying to sort of like get the youth away from gangs and that sort of thing. And so in a lot of speeches and that kind of thing, the party's statement of aims and values, particularly in around 2005, 2006, when Cameron was elected leader of the Tory party, was kind of emphasizing a modern compassionate conservatism. And at their 2011 party conference, they released a pamphlet called Modern Compassionate Conservatism, and talked a lot about the need for compassionate, kind of cuddly policies, as I say, like hug a hoodie. But it's this sort of, it's less of the kind of Margaret Thatcher kind of hard-edged 80s conservatism, which is quite tough. I mean, if you think about how she broke the unions and forced people back to work, all the sort of strikers and that sort of thing, she didn't have any truck with their sort of complaints or their grievances, really. She was quite hard-edged. She was very focused on getting the economy back up and running, and so there was the whole kind of thing about Big Bang. And it's interesting that, as I say, that Liz Truss is trying to emulate her. I mean, Kwasi Kwarteng actually used the term like Big Bang 2, and it was just so badly timed. I don't think we can kind of go back to the 80s and this idea that if you get the city, up and running and profitable, that's going to sort of have this trickle-down effect, this sort of trickle-down economics that's going to then benefit the rest of the country. Like, yes, the city and financial services plays a very big part in terms of generating GDP, but that was the old economic model, and that collapsed in 2008 because we found, everyone discovered that a lot of the wealth was actually based on smoke and mirrors and sort of all these kind of packaged sort of these so-called sort of like commodities and that kind of thing that were just sort of debt packaged up as something else. So essentially in 2015, David Cameron, wanted to sort of he was a modern compassionate conservative who was supposed to help them distance themselves from this idea of the Nazi Party, which is to say, became very prevalent in the sort of the 80s after the austerity and the difficulties of the stagflation of the 70s. And it's interesting that Jeremy Hunt, as I say, began his political career at the time that Cameron kind of came to government. And you can see this in a lot of his values and his disposition, that he is somebody who seems to centre a lot around service, around people, and around like a certain innate kindness, but also a firmness, which I think possibly he gets from his sort of his family's military background. It's kind of like doing the difficult thing and sort of staying the course, that kind of thing, like toughing it out. And I think that this very much kind of sums up this sort of signature quality about him. This comes from an interview with the New Statesman. He said, "I don't think anyone would say that I've had easy jobs in politics. As Culture Secretary, I had the nightmare of Leveson, where for a period the whole country quite wrongly thought that I was conspiring with the Murdochs. After that, I had Health Secretary, where I didn't just have the junior doctor strike, I had a permanent lack of money, repeated winter crises because of pressures on the front line, including the terrible flu crisis in my last winter in the job. But then, as Foreign Secretary, I've got Brexit." So, as I say, not someone to sort of shy away from a crisis, definitely somebody who is very good at coming in and fixing things. And I think we'll see why when we look at his chart. But I think it's interesting that he's been called in right now when the government is in crisis, when the economy is in crisis, and he seems to be the man again who's kind of coming to sort of steady the ship. All right, so let's move on to his chart. Now, I think the thing to bear in mind is that we also don't know 100% what his birth time is. There has been a one time given, which is around 7 a.m. On the 1st of November 1966. We're not sure if this is 100% correct, but I've kind of gone with it. My gut instinct is that he probably is not Scorpio rising. I would be inclined to think that he's actually got Sagittarius rising. And that's because first of all, he's kind of tall. Secondly, he's a little bit goofy. There's something quite goofy about him, especially if you sort of see him smile. There's sort of like a twinkle in his eye, and he's known to be a little bit gaffe-prone or clumsy, which is very often which is associated with Sagittarius, that kind of clown sort of effect of being quite funny and not always intentionally so. But for now, I'm going to go with this time, which was given by, I think, Penny Thornton, a UK astrologer, and we're just going to kind of like stick with that for now. So this chart has Scorpio rising, and it's also got his sun Venus conjunction kind of rising in the 12th house. And this is one of the things that a lot of people say about him is first of all how nice he is and how charming he is. Not in an oily way. I heard one journalist describe him as having an emollient leadership style, which I took to mean somebody who can smooth things sort of over, who can kind of pour oil on troubled waters. And as I say, he is known for this. For kind of coming in and sort of calming situations down that have reached crisis point or where there's been a standoff of some kind. And I do think that this Sun-Venus conjunction really helps him with that. That he is very charming, he's very diplomatic, he certainly knows how to win people over. But he doesn't do it in the way that, say, Boris Johnson does it, which is charming, but can sometimes be a little bit insincere. There's definitely a sense of depth with him, and I think it's interesting that the Sun and Venus are both in the sign of Scorpio, which is known for sort of like depth, for kind of penetrating insight, and at its best is very principled. And a lot of people say that about him, that he is very a very principled person. So I think having a Sun. And a lot of politicians have some kind of either the Sun in Libra, like David Cameron, or they have Libra rising, which I think Boris Johnson does. I can't remember now. Or they have like a Sun-Venus conjunction, and I think he shares this with Rishi Sunak, although it's in different signs. I think Rishi's is in Taurus, if I'm not mistaken. But to have a Sun-Venus conjunction in Scorpio is interesting because I think it probably offsets some of his the potential intensity that can come with being a Sun Scorpio, and also mean that he isn't known for being calculating, which some Scorpios are. They sort of have this reputation for being schemers. You don't get that sense with him at all. He seems very sort of upright and quite decent and quite sort of straightforward, even if, as I say, sometimes he has to be quite tough, and not everybody likes that. So that's interesting. He also, if this chart is correct, has Neptune in the first house, and I find this interesting. I mean, it certainly sits with the South Node, and there is something, as I say, that's very compassionate and empathic about him. You get the sense when he's being interviewed that there's a certain decency about him, and that he is very service oriented, and I think this comes out, as I say, in his style of politics with this compassionate conservatism. So I think that Neptune, in this sense, is probably responsible for that. You know, it does tend to make people very altruistic, very service oriented, somebody who believes in sort of sacrificing their own needs for the greater good. And again, you know, he is. I think one of his friends described him as a cross between Richard Branson and the Archbishop of Canterbury. And apparently he is quite like the Queen, he is quite a serious Christian. You know, he doesn't necessarily go to church all the time, but he does practice Christian values. And I guess that would fit. You know, Pisces is considered to be the sign most associated with Christianity, this idea of kind of sacrifice and of selflessness. So I think that again fits quite well, and it does explain what motivates him when it comes to politics. You know, that he is very service oriented. So that for me is interesting. And then if this house position is correct, it will also give him Mercury in Sagittarius in the first house, and that could be a little bit where we see this slightly more clownish, goofy sort of aspect kind of coming through. You know, there was, I think, one famous story where he was sort of ringing a bell and and it sort of fell apart and nearly sort of hit some lady. So he is a little bit gaffe prone, but as I say, in a kind of a comical way, in a sort of a harmless way, not to the same extent as Boris, who many people feel cultivates that sort of that persona of the kind of the gaffe prone schoolboy type of thing. With Jeremy Hunt, it's more it's almost like the gentle giant, you know, who sort of maybe sometimes doesn't realize his own strength, or is a little bit naive, or like unsuspecting, and so can sort of walk into things or do things without thinking. So another example is where he was talking to somebody at a diplomatic dinner, and he speaks fluent Japanese, and was talking in Japanese to a fellow diplomat, and then turned to the Chinese ambassador and said, "Oh, my wife is..." the Japanese ambassador, and said, "Oh, my wife is Japanese, and his wife is actually Chinese." And he was like, "Oh no, sorry," and then sort of apologized. Did quite a funny sort of apology on Twitter about his long-suffering wife, Mrs. H, who is Chinese. So it's that kind of almost harmless gaffes, and unlike Liz Truss with her sort of her Uranus-Jupiter hard aspects that have, I think, led to slightly more serious gaffes, like, you know, this massive U-turn in terms of policy that Jeremy has been tasked with introducing. So those are kind of key things. And then the other reason, you know, as I was saying, he is known as the crisis guy, or the guy who's here to fix things. And I think one of the reasons for this is probably the fact that he has this little sort of mini-stellium of Mars, Pluto, and Uranus all in the sign of Virgo. And as I say, Virgo is known for being very good at fixing things. It's a sign associated with detail, with kind of manual work, very fine manual work, with kind of sharpness, and also with practicality. That it's a problem solver, a troubleshooter. And that combination is extremely powerful, and especially if you think about the combination of Pluto and Uranus. I mean, these are huge reformers. And then you've got this drive of Mars, which I do see as being quite that sort of military background that he has. He has this motivation that he can sort of set his sights, focus on one thing, and then he'll see it through to completion. He will execute almost to sort of a ruthless degree. And I think that's why, you know, junior doctors really hate him so much. But it's also why he's known for being the guy to call in a crisis, because he's not going to just fold at the first hurdle. He's going to sort of like make the tough decisions. And he said that a lot in his speeches the last few days. So I think that's interesting. So I think that this is what drives him in terms of, you know, his need to reform, you know, that talk about making changes and not necessarily doing it for the greater good and not for popularity's sake. You know, Pluto and Uranus both are not necessarily popularity seekers. They tend to be people who are very driven in terms of what they see as sort of higher goals, which may mean, as I say, making difficult decisions in the short term, kind of short-term pain for long-term gain, that kind of thing. And then, as I say, the fact that it's in the sign of Virgo is very practical. It's very details-driven. It wants to sort of like come in. It will get to the nitty-gritty. It'll get down to the nitty-gritty, and then make lists and make sure that that every detail is sort of like seen to, and that a solution is ultimately sort of executed, almost with military precision, given Pluto and Mars. So interesting that. Now, what's also interesting is that it's opposite Saturn, his Saturn-Chiron conjunction in Pisces. Now, this is very interesting, I feel, because that particular combination of Saturn-Chiron in Pisces is quite soft, actually, and it is, to me, he kind of gives off the demeanor of a doctor. He has that sort of, that sense of sympathetic assurance, that quiet assurance that you get from a lot of doctors, that have a good bedside manner. And I do think that this comes from his Saturn-Chiron combination, which will make him somebody who is very sympathetic with the underdog, who wants to make a difference, and who's kind of cautious in terms of the way that he goes about introducing structures or kind of boundaries, that he's always mindful of how it's going to impact other people, and he tries to be as sort of like kind and compassionate as he can. But then with this opposition, he's often torn, I think, between the two extremes of wanting to be sort of compassionate and kind on one hand, and to be of service, but then on the other hand, sometimes being forced into that, as I say, that almost sort of military, that sort of ruthless military precision of needing to execute and to do so in a kind of quite cold, not unfeeling way, but certainly into taking your feelings out of the equation and sort of doing what needs to be done. So I think often pulled in those two extremes. And it's interesting that what probably saves him is the fact that both of those combinations of planets are making positive aspects to Neptune. So I think this is what kind of pulls it all together, is that his intentions are good, in the sense that he's coming from a place of wanting to be of service, of altruism, and of kind of selflessness. He's not doing it for glory. He's not doing it for personal glory or gain. He's doing it because he believes that it's the right thing to do for the country, or for a particular system, or a particular community. So I think that's kind of the saving grace is this Neptune. And it's interesting that it's with the South Node, because even though the South Node tends to be considered where we kind of slip on our banana skin, so where we tend to have blind spots, it can also be where we have gifts, things that we've learned from previous lives and are now really good at, that we can sort of almost do in our sleep. And if you consider the combination here of Neptune, then it seems to me that this sort of innate kindness, this desire to be of service, may come from other lives, where he has possibly been some sort of, kind of religious leader, or a monk, or something, sort of lived quite an altruistic life. And I think in this particular life, given the sextile to Pluto and to Uranus and to Mars, that there does seem to be a need to try and now balance that altruism with the need to learn to handle power responsibly and in a way that benefits the community. And we'll see this quite strongly when it comes to his human design, that is almost set up in his incarnation cross. So that's very interesting that we're getting this sort of crossover with the nodes, the nodal axis. Then the other thing to sort of note about his chart is the fact that he's got the moon in Gemini. And I think this is so interesting for somebody who is so compassionate, that he actually does have quite an impersonal moon. The moon in an air sign is very often not that comfortable in the realm of emotions, or is certainly good at sort of detaching emotionally from a situation, which can be a good thing, actually, and particularly if you're going into something like politics, that you do need to be able to not necessarily have a thick skin, but not take things personally, And people do say this about him, that he does have this ability to work with people across party and across, even if he's had differences with somebody, that he can set those aside, not let his ego get in the way, or personal differences, unlike, say, someone like Boris Johnson, who's known for kind of holding grudges and sort of like kind of waging vendetta campaigns. That he's not petty like that he can put aside kind of personal differences and work together with somebody for a kind of a cause that's greater in order to achieve something meaningful. So it's interesting that when we look at the dignities, that the moon actually is the most dignified planet in his chart. And, in this chart, it rules the ninth house of principles and like belief. So I suppose it would fit with that if it's in the eighth house, which is about working with others, often one other person, there's this sense of kind of, but it can be organizations, because it can also be about institutions like banks or that type of thing, that he's very good at sort of working with other people for the greater good, in terms of his principles, which is at that kind of ninth house. And then in the ninth house itself, we have Jupiter in Leo. And I think this is what gives him his innate confidence. There is an air of confidence about him. It's not ego type of confidence. It's this kind of quiet confidence where he does command like a room, where people do listen to him, where people take him seriously. There have been some accusations of him being like a political windsock. But they've kind of come, the person who kind of leveled them ultimately retracted the sort of the accusation, and a lot of people disagreed, with that they felt that it's not that he doesn't have convictions, it's that he will toe the party line and he will do what is required of him, I suppose, like a good soldier, but that ultimately, he does have very strong principles. And certainly having Jupiter in the ninth house, which is its natural domicile, would indicate that he does come from a position of principled leadership. If you think about the sign of Leo, it is associated strongly with leadership. So principled leadership. And again, it's interesting that it is trying to Mercury. So again, very good for a politician, someone who's very principled and who wants to persuade, but, and he wants to create laws and policies around things that matter, things that have meaning, things that are going to sort of benefit society. It is square to his Sun Venus conjunction, and this could be where the slightly more goofy kind of aspect comes in, where he sometimes, as I say, makes these gaffes. It can also mean that he is that he's kind of that he's well-meaning, but that sometimes may like overdo it. Jupiter can sometimes, when it's negatively aspected, tend to overdo things or be a little bit like give unsolicited advice, or sort of come across as being a little bit condescending. That's certainly a possibility with that square, but I think it will be unintentional, given that the Sun and Venus are in the 12th house, or maybe he will do it behind the scenes so that you don't necessarily see that about him in terms of his public persona. It's an interesting one, but what I also think is interesting is that having Jupiter in the 9th house does point to his background as a teacher. Jupiter's in that sense, 9th house can be about higher education, teachers, mentors, gurus, and also foreign travel. So I think it does speak of his adventurousness and his desire to sort of like see other places and live in other parts of the world, that kind of thing. So that's an interesting one. I also think that I forgot to mention this, that Saturn in Pisces is ruler of his 3rd house. So I think it does speak of, as I say, of the way that he communicates and expresses himself, that there is this sense with him that you get the sense that he's a solid person, that you can rely on him with that Saturn, but then that he's also very empathic and understands when people feel like outsiders or they don't feel heard, or that he's very good at, as I say, at sort of making people feel seen and validated, and that this is his gift as a politician. So I think that fits very well. And also that he's quite empathic and careful. He's not someone who who shoots his mouth off. he is someone who's quite careful about what he says. And I think that having Saturn ruling his third house, fits with that. I mean, if for example, he did have Sagittarius rising, it would put that Saturn in his third house. So that also would fit, I think. So I'm for me, the jury's still out about whether he's got Scorpio or Sagittarius rising. The other thing to say about him is that he has a lot of mutable water in his chart. So this is someone who is quite emotional, and he describes himself as caring passionately and deeply about things. And I think that example about patient care and sort of like patient safety is one example of that. And you do get that sense from him that he is a very caring person. Albeit in a thoughtful way. And again, I think we'll see this when we come to his human design. His type, I think, really kind of speaks to this. But yes, a lot of mutable water, so somebody who's very empathic, who cares, and who is people-oriented, who's, as I say, is very sort of, who's heart kind of based. But I don't think that it comes across in a sort of a gushy or a mushy way because of his very restrained military background, first of all, and secondly, these slightly more inhibiting aspects from, as I say, Saturn, for example, Saturn Chiron. If it is correctly placed in the fourth house, it would suggest that maybe he had a mother who was quite restrained or a little bit inhibited or shy, for example. I do think it's interesting that he married someone who's Oriental, because I do get the sense that he is quite a shy person when it comes to his personal life, that he's not a sort of a great big Casanova. And I think the fact that he marries somebody Oriental, that tends to be very sensitive and is kind of has that very yin aspect to femininity. I think kind of speaks to this. So that for me is also really, really interesting. But let's move on to his chart in relation to the Conservative Party and see how different, for example, his role may be within the party as opposed to, for example, Liz Truss. So here we've got his chart on the outside, and then we've got the Tory party chart on the inside. So this is again the 1912 chart, the same one I used for Liz Truss's and profile analysis. So it's interesting, we've got a slightly different emphasis here. Again, we've got overlaps with the midheaven again, and this seems to be a key feature of people that are prominent in the party. So in this case, we've got his MC-IC axis going across the midheaven and the IC. So it's sitting kind of over that Sun-Saturn conjunction in Taurus, which is sort of central to the Tory party. So they do like continuity. They do like a kind of someone who's a steady Eddie, if you like, someone who's not going to sort of like throw a lot of curveballs or surprises. And this is what he's here to learn. So it does seem as though, from a kind of an evolutionary point of view, from a kind of karmic point of view, that the reason that he's kind of in politics and part of the Conservative Party is because he's here to learn exactly those qualities. So he's learning to sort of take these qualities on from a kind of a personal point of view, and at the same time, the party is kind of helping to teach him this. And then opposite that, we've got his Sun Venus conjunction along with the South Node, that Neptune and then Mercury in Sagittarius. And again, it's interesting because this does form an opposition. So there is this push-pull within him, but also within the Tory party. I think between that sort of the hard-edged stuff, which you could potentially associate with Sun-Saturn. It can be a little bit sometimes cold and unfeeling and sort of ruthlessly wants to stay in power. But then on the other hand, you've got the Scorpio stuff, which is interestingly. It's hidden, but this could be where the sort of slightly more maternal aspect of the kind of compassionate conservatism kind of comes in. And if you think that the moon rules the maternal in astrology as an archetype, the fact that the Conservative Party's got that moon Chiron conjunction in Pisces on the 7th cusp does point to a need for compassion and for that kind of Cameron style of leadership, because that's what's going to appeal to the electorate. And it's interesting that, the electorate would be represented by the seventh house, by others in this chart. So it's a very interesting and delicate balance that has to be kind of walked in politics between, that's ruthless side that needs to kind of get into power and that has to, kind of play the political game on the one hand, with the need to do good, kind of those two things needing to be balanced. So, as I say, interesting that all his very charming stuff, his very compassionate stuff is, opposite that Sun Saturn combination on the midheaven, and that could be why he hasn't been elected as leader, up to this point. Why he's always sort of been pipped at the post by somebody else, that potentially the Tory party don't see him as being ruthless enough, essentially, to actually lead the party. So that's an interesting one, and I think to an extent it's maybe a little bit of a misnomer, which we'll see when we look at his human design. And also, if we consider the fact that he's got that combination of Mars, Pluto, and Uranus in the first house of the Tory party. So he is somebody who gets things done, and that's very important to Tories if you think about that Virgo sort of energy that's ruling the first house, that it is very important that someone is good with detail, that they get things done, that they don't have huge egos, that they are more about, as I say, towing the party line or sort of being a team player, that he's very good at that. And what's interesting is that, again, that this runs counter to that Moon Chiron combination on the seventh house cusp, that again the balance needs to be struck between this desire to sort of get things done on the one hand, to be pragmatic, and then this desire for compassionate conservatism on the other. And I think he does balance those two things very well, actually. So I think it's fascinating that that particular combination sits across the first and seventh houses of the Tory party, because I think that's something that they are wrestling with themselves as a party. So that's interesting. Then his moon is conjunct the what do you call it? The Tory party part of fortune. So again, interesting that, as I say, that where the Tory party sort of fortune lies is where his moon sits. So he instinctively understands what will bring the party good PR, what will sort of keep them going in the right direction. He instinctively understands what is required to do this. And that part of it is not taking things personally, like not getting into infighting and pettiness, that kind of thing. And also, I mean, it's a dual sign, which is interesting. So being able to sort of balance these two opposite qualities, which we are seeing a lot, in terms of these oppositions, between his nodal axis on the one hand, and then, this opposition here across the first and seventh houses. So a lot of balancing of kind of opposite extremes here, which he's quite good at doing. But again, we've got another opposition here. In the Tory chart, we've got the part of fortune being opposed to Jupiter. So, in a sense, and it's interesting too that Sagittarius is intercepted, in the fourth house. I think it just sits on the cusp of the fifth. So, again, the one thing that you don't hear a lot of in the Tory party when they are kind of talking about a leader, or in terms of their sort of rhetoric, is you don't really hear a lot about principles. You don't hear a lot about like beliefs, or kind of anyone with a sort of almost religious zeal for certain principles. So I think that's kind of interesting that he that he seems with his moon to be almost a reminder to the party of what is good and decent, and the kind of the right thing to do from a kind of a heart-based perspective, and not kind of getting too bogged down in this idea of not necessarily gambling with the country's future. I mean, the fourth house can be about their attitude to women, it can be about domestic policy, it can be about what goes on in terms of internal politics. And as I say, there does seem to be a lot of infighting that happens in the Tory party, and it can, get in the way of what they want to achieve, and that is the 10th house. So I think he's a very good reminder of what not to do as a politician, not sort of get into cliques, not sort of get into petty arguments or kind of power struggles, and to try and maintain your focus on the right things. So, in that sense, he sets a very good example. And then the other thing that's interesting is that, although he's got that opposition with his Mars, Pluto, Uranus kind of stellium to the moon and Chiron, the 7th house, that this is also trying to his Sun Venus conjunction here. So we can see the moon making a trine here to that Sun Venus conjunction. So again, I think this is his diplomacy at work, his kind of natural charm and his niceness and decency. And I think again reminding the Tories of that compassion and conservatism that's needed in order for the sort of the public, particularly the working classes, to sort of trust the Tory party, because they are seen as the party of the ruling elite, of the sort of the upper classes. That was traditionally what the Tories or the Whigs were all about, was sort of the ruling classes, the lords and ladies of the nobility. So to get away from that image, he's very good at reminding the party and of epitomizing, as I said, this idea of compassion and conservatism. So, in that sense, I think tapping into that's the sentiments of that Moon Chiron conjunction, which is going to really appeal to voters. And then also this particular, his Venus is also in a T-square with Jupiter to the Tory party Venus, which is here in the 9th house. So that's an interesting potential clash of values and principles. And again, this may be why he has not become leader, is that maybe his personal values and his sense of inner principles about putting people first, runs counter to the party's need for power, maybe power at all costs. It's interesting that Venus, the Tory party Venus, is in Taurus, which can be about maintaining the status quo. So like the landed gentry, for example. So maintaining the class system, sort of directly or indirectly. And that has been one of the criticisms leveled at Britain, is that it's not really in any way, shape or form a meritocracy, that there is this underlying sort of open secret that if you want to kind of get anywhere, you have to go to the right schools, you have to sort of associate with the right people, you have to sort of be plugged into the sort of the behind the scenes systems of power, the sort of the elite that still kind of run the show from their sort of clubs and that kind of thing. So, in that sense, I don't think he really epitomizes that. He did go to very good schools. He went to Charterhouse, he went to Oxford, and so, in that sense, he did do the whole kind of Oxbridge thing, and he had a very good education. But I think coming from a military background, this is more kind of middle class, sort of upper middle class. So not somebody who's born into a position of privilege, somebody who's kind of earned that right through his father's hard work, kind of going up the ranks through the Navy. So in that sense, maybe he is a little bit too middle class for a lot of people within the Tory kind of ranks. These are sort of the old style Tories. So that's interesting. And then also there's a T-square to Mars. So this Mars is in the 1st house. You can see there's a big kind of red triangle here with that part of fortune and Jupiter. So again, maybe some people feel that he pushes too far, that he's too critical sometimes of certain things that go on behind the scenes, or that maybe get in the way of the party. But every party needs, or organization needs, a critic, someone who's going to point out flaws or faults. And as long as solutions are offered as to how this can be fixed, which I think that's stellium in Virgo can do, then I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing. It might sort of ruffle a few feathers, but ultimately, I think what he's saying is don't take it personally, just see it as ways to improve, and that's really the way to do it, rather than the Jupiter, which can be a little bit, as I said, pompous and bombastic, and don't tell me what to do, don't tell Granny how to suck eggs, sort of thing. That in that sense, he may sort of rub some people up the wrong way. They might seem as a little bit sanctimonious or self-righteous, that kind of thing. And then the other thing to say is that his Pluto-Uranus conjunction is trying to the Tory party's Sun Saturn on the 10th. So that's really good. And as I say, he does seem to be the cleanup guy, the fix-it guy who kind of comes in, and if something needs to be kind of hatcheted, and there needs to be sort of a ruthless unpicking of a policy that is clearly not working or isn't popular, he's the person to do it. And he's quite rightly recognised for that with that trine, because it puts the party back on the right footing, to sort of admit mistakes, to undo things that aren't working, that aren't practical, etc., etc. And interesting that it's also sextile to the Tory party Mars Neptune conjunction here in the 11th. So it's going to make them more popular. They're going to be seen as more compassionate conservatives, people who do things that are done in the spirit of service, that are there to sort of to care for, this is, I suppose you could see this as a little bit of the nanny state, because it is in Cancer. So that's sort of that welfare system. But when times are kind of tough, I think it is really important to have that sort of safety net for people. If you look back to the days prior to that being in existence, so the pre-war years, certainly at the turn of the century, the only sort of welfare state there was the church, and also the sort of the lords of the manor, who would kind of preside over these kind of local courts or hearings, if you like, where they would discuss local matters and mete out sort of justice to people who had sort of broken the law or that kind of thing. And that was for a long time one of the roles of landed gentry, and that this then got passed to the state. And so you could in a way see that Neptune Mars conjunction as being that responsibility within governing for the Tory party itself, because it is in the 11th house of groups and ideals. But now what's also super interesting is the focus of the chart. If you think that this has got Virgo rising, so Mercury is the ruler of the chart, and that Tory party Mercury in Aries is forming a yod to first of all that stellium that Hunter's got in the first house, and then secondly that sun, to the Neptune South Node combination. And it's interesting, the yod is considered to be like the finger of destiny or the finger of God. So it's very often, it's almost as though he's been sort of ordained, or kind of has taken on the role of showing the Tory party where they need to change in order to sort of modernize. And that's not always easy, because it can make you a scapegoat. If people don't want to kind of own, or an organization doesn't want to sort of own its shadow side or its need for change or reform, then it's very easy for it to sort of deflect and project that outwards and to sort of scapegoat that person. And again, this may point to why he hasn't become leader of the Tory party, is that part of what he's there to sort of do is to reflect some stuff back to them which need to change. So that's really, really interesting. And then finally, his Mercury is sextile the Tory party Uranus. So that Uranus is in the 6th house, and it is about reform. It's interesting. It's about reform. And, I think with his Mercury being in Sagittarius here, which is quite positive and optimistic, that's a very positive quality. So I think he's quite good at motivating members of the Tory party, say his cabinet, or say if he was in a position of power, or just his department, to actually make the changes that are needed in order to sort of get things done. And that's a very positive quality to have in a politician. Mercury being often about persuasion, that he can persuade through enthusiasm, instilling enthusiasm in others to sort of like go out and do the not necessarily like the done thing, but what the necessary thing, the sort of turning convention on its head when it's necessary, and making changes, modernizing, where necessary. That he is, in a sense, a great modernizer. So he's not only a fixer-upper, but he's also a modernizer. So really, really interesting, I think. Totally different role in the Tory party to say Rishi or Liz Truss. So let's move on to his human design. Now this is, for me, again, where things get really, really interesting. So I think he tends to be somebody who is underestimated in terms of their power. So I find it fascinating that he is a 2-4 manifester. And it's not something that you would expect, but think about this for a minute. Another person who's got exactly the same type is Johnny Depp. He's also a 2-4 manifester. And he's also somebody who is often underestimated in terms of his kind of personal power. That it's almost like hidden power. And I think in Jeremy's case, he's got emotional authority. So even though he is a traditional manifester, which is considered to be one of the most powerful of the body graph sort of types, the what do you call it? I always get the terminology sort of mixed up. The type, that's right, the type. So his type is a manifester. Because, I mean, traditionally manifestors are considered to be those who have the ability to activate movement in others, to motivate, to get things done. They tend to have the ability to catalyze activity in the world around you and to manifest life, to move toward whatever you set your intentions or your desires on. So these are people who can make things happen, who have the energetic signature to be able to make things happen. We often talk about this idea of manifesting and, that everyone is a magician in their own life. But, I think that the reality for a lot of people is that that's not true. They might have tried their sort of hardest and they've never been able to actually make this happen. And I think human design really explains why, that certain people have that throat center switched on, certain people do not. So energetically, some people are set up to naturally kind of manifest and make things happen, and other people have to wait for opportunities to come their way or be asked to do something or invited. So the manifestor is, as I say, the person who is someone who has a drive and is a natural leader. So very good at inspiring cooperative support from others. So I think it's interesting that, he's got very few centers highlighted in his chart, that all of his energy seems to be concentrated on the throat, the emotions, and then the two kind of cerebral centers, so the crown and the ajna, the third eye. So somebody who's very cerebral, but who's also very emotional, and who can use his expression, his voice, to persuade others of ideas. So it's somebody who is a natural teacher, somebody who's also very good at informing. So, I mean, in that sense, a teacher can be someone who informs. So can a politician. Obviously, we tend to think of it more in terms of like a journalist. But there is that quality about him of being able to take information or conviction and be able to express it in a way that resonates with other people on an emotional level. So I think it's interesting that the one channel, he's only got 2 channels that are kind of closed or completed in his natal body graph, and that is the 35-36, which links the throat to the emotional center, and then the 23-43, which links the third eye, the ajna center, so the mind, to the throat. So he's able to express ideas and knowledge. And it's similar to Rishi Sunak, actually. I think he's also got that center, that channel kind of highlighted. And what's fascinating is that in terms of the last leadership race, he supported Rishi Sunak, but has kind of he's been invited into the Truss government, and it's almost as if, you do wonder whether in fact he is a proxy for Rishi, that Liz Truss could not be seen to invite her arch nemesis or her kind of competitor from the leadership race into her cabinet, but she could invite a kind of a proxy, somebody who might be able to consult with Rishi or who is of like mind, and sort of introduce those ideas without necessarily causing like a big stir or creating a lot of dissent. So that's an interesting thing. But as I say, what's interesting is that, like Liz Truss, who's also a manifester with emotional authority, she's a manifesting generator, or she's a generating manifestor, really. But she also has emotional authority. So in that sense, there is kind of overlap between the two of them, that they do make decisions more based on their emotions than on their intellect. And as I say, in fact, nobody has a center of authority in the mind center. So that's, I think, really, really interesting about human design. So both of them led by their emotions, that they need to sort of like sit on things overnight and stew before they make up their mind, that they have to also sort of respect the need for the emotional wave to just sort of break before they commit to something, and that they are very kind of heart-led in the sort of more traditional sense. So someone who has a decision-making process closely intertwined with emotional feelings, and feelings can rise and fall from extremes, from one extreme to another. So these people need to give themselves time in order to kind of gauge their feelings, and should not act on impulse or conditioning. So instead, they need to find emotional clarity before they make decisions. And I think a good example was Liz Truss rushing in, just to sort of save the day, probably in her mind. She's kind of said this yesterday, that they went too far too fast, which is in keeping with her Jupiter in Aries, and that it wasn't the right time for those kinds of policies, that maybe she should have stopped to sort of think things through more carefully before introducing those policies, and that maybe there shouldn't have been a mini budget statement as early as there was, that they should have given themselves more time to really think through what would be most appropriate and pragmatic given current geopolitical circumstances, the cost of living crisis, etc., before sort of deciding or kind of firming up their policies, because most of those things have now been undone by Jeremy Hunt. So I find that kind of interesting. Now, what is even more interesting for me is that he is a 2-4 type, and this is it's an unusual combination, put it this way, the 2-4 and a manifestor, because the 2-4 is someone who's very heart-based and heart-led. They tend to be kind of natural hermits, and they oscillate very often between needing to sort of withdraw from the world and have a lot of alone time in order to recharge or to think clearly, and then sort of being called back into the world or into their community in order to sort of to relate. So relationships form the foundation of their life, and they care very deeply about certain things, and connecting is important to them, but they've got to balance this with their need for alone time. So it's interesting. I mean, he's not someone that kind of comes across as a massively extrovert, gregarious person, but he is very affable, and I think this comes from the line 2, which is very natural and unaffected, and very like kind and friendly, and that initially 2-4 types tend to be quite naive when they first sort of like come into the world. They're playful and fun, so there's a childlike quality to them which makes them very lovable, but at the same time they also tend to be, as I say, a little bit innocent, gullible, and sort of like naive. So some people can try and take advantage of them, and I think for the 2-4s there's always the need to sort of strike this balance in terms of personal boundaries and like personal emotional discernment about who to trust, who not to trust, who to let in, who not to let in, and who is kind of part of one's natural tribe and who isn't. So it's interesting that he's got into politics, which is can be a lot about sort of fakeness. So I think what he kind of brings is this genuine like love of life and this genuine desire to sort of bring people together. And I think it's reflected too in his right angle cross of his cross of incarnation. So this is made up from, it's almost like the angles in astrology, but it's made up of the sun, the earth, and I think the nodes. So it's this kind of cross. And for him, he's got the right angle cross of the 4 ways, which is associated with the energy to guide and direct based on the past. So someone who can kind of look back at history, at past precedent, and who can then sort of like learn from that and then use this to manage people, to provide for the group or the tribe. So he is a leader in many ways. And what's also interesting is that he's got the sun in gate 44, which is in the spleen. And this is so much about acting instinctively for the good of the group. So that there's this kind of sense with him that he instinctively kind of knows, and with that 2343 as well, this can also be about like hearing. It's about kind of, it's often about clairaudience, or just kind of hearing the solution, knowing exactly what to do, and then sort of like not knowing how you know, but then being able to communicate that to others. So he really is in a sense like an old-fashioned community or family business. He's the one who assigns the tasks so that everything comes together and the community has everything it needs. So this is part of his role. And I think it's what was missing in the sort of the cabinet, that there didn't seem to be this person who was a good unifier, and this is really what he's so good at. So you could almost say that he is the power potentially behind the throne, that he's somebody who's very good at working behind the scenes to sort of bring people together around consensus, around what needs to be done, around shared principles or shared goals, that kind of thing. That's really what he's here to kind of learn. And again, I think it's interesting that he went into politics late in life, because a lot of his centres that are associated with leadership other than the throat are not switched on at this point, in his natal chart, but they do come on later when he gets to, first of all, his Uranus opposition, and then secondly, his Chiron return. So we'll look at that in a minute. But the other thing that's interesting about his chart is that it is single definition, and this means that all the channels are working in the same direction. So you've got this kind of downward movement from the ajna to the throat, and then from the throat to the emotional center, and that this all flows in one direction. He doesn't need other people to complete some of his circuits. That he's quite self-contained, which I think fits again with this idea of a 2-4 type. A 2-4 profile, rather. I keep getting the terms wrong. So he's a 2-4 profile. And I think it's also why there's a sense of purity about him, that he is really just here to express ideas and to refine thinking and to connect to people's emotions and to persuade or to kind of teach. That he is able to assimilate knowledge and insight, and is very good at listening and at teaching, but often needs to be invited in order to speak, or to sort of share his knowledge. I think luckily, he is a manifester. So this is what sets him apart from Rishi. Rishi's a generator. So he's almost, as I say, like a proxy for Rishi, but a more powerful one from an energetic point of view, who can actually speak the policies and will be heard. I think that's really, really interesting. So just looking quickly at his luminary. So as I say, he does have the sun in gate 44. And this is traditionally known in the I Ching as coupling, but in this particular center, which is associated with the splenic awareness of survival, it's about alertness. So it's about being able to quickly assess who in your environment you can trust, or like who's the right person for the job, and then sort of like approaching them. So it's interesting that he has that knack, which I think a politician needs, or a leader needs, in order to be able to sort of kind of assemble a team around him that's going to be very effective. But I do think, with that 2-4 profile, that he is an ambivert. So he's someone who's kind of thrust into different life experiences, but then still needs to withdraw sometimes into reflection in order to make sense of them. That there's this constant push-pull dynamic within him, that, even though he is sort of someone who is in public service and a part of public life, that he also needs a lot of alone time or downtime in order to sort of process and to know what to do. And I think this is part of what makes him so self-contained, that inner confidence and radiance and peace that people speak of. This comes from his 2-4 profile, that there is a part of him that is quite self-contained, and that is almost a little bit like a Buddha, that sort of can withdraw to a source within, that keeps him emotionally stable, and that he can draw on this to sort of maintain his composure in sort of any situation, in like in a crisis. And that's what makes him so the sort of the right sort to have around, when you do have a crisis. He's very calm. And then he's got the moon in gate 35, which, as I say, is part of essentially what makes him a manifester. So one of the main channels. So he's got it in the throat center here, and it's part of the, as I say, the channel that links the emotional center to the throat. So it's very much driven by that emotional wave and the ability to not only express emotions really well, which I think he is very good at, but also to evoke emotional responses in others. And I think he does this in a really precise way. And I think it's fascinating that he's got the moon in Gemini, which is so much about the mind and about communication. But it also has a light touch. it's also to do with someone who has a light touch. So, I think it's interesting that one journalist asked, what does he have that Sir David Cameron and George Osborne did not? And the journalist kind of ventures an opinion, a deeper emotional intelligence and wisdom, and essential kindness. And I do think this is something that he exudes, and it may be because of this sort of the empathy that he has with the moon here in the throat center, connecting to the emotional center down here, which is switched on by his Saturn. Yes, so quite restrained, quite paternal, but in a quite, as I say, a soft yin way, with that moon Chiron conjunction. So just moving on quickly to his Chiron return, you can see that when we get to the Chiron return, there are so many more centers switched on now compared to his natal body graph. So this is when he starts to kind of come into his own. But as I say, to me, it did start a little bit earlier at his Uranus opposition, which interestingly is the same year that he got married. So that's sort of the opposite of what usually happens at the Uranus opposition. Usually people tend to get divorced or kind of move away from relationships. They tend to want their freedom. And in his case, he did the opposite. He got married. So I think that's really interesting. But it's just talking about his Chiron return, because this is the one that is the most recent of the sort of midlife transits. This is the one that gives him a new body graph or chart, which he then works with for the rest of his life. So you can see a lot more powerful now, like every center switched on except for his sacral. And so he still needs other people around him, like worker bees and supporters and like family members, like a support structure around him in order to sort of make things happen and to keep him moving, energetically. He does have the root center switched on, which I think will help to ground him and certainly help when it comes to like health and everyday kind of routines. But the sacral center is essentially it's our energy center, it's life force. So you need that in order to sort of like keep the wheels turning. And that's the one thing he doesn't have. I'd be interested to know whether his wife's body graph switches that center on. That would be sort of interesting to know. But anyway, the sun and the moon have now moved. They've progressed. So the sun is now in gate 17. This interestingly is the gate of service. So it's really kind of bringing to the fore all that stuff we saw around his Neptune south node, his Saturn Chiron, a lot of that orientation towards service. Now he's in a position to actually be of service. He's got the will center switched on. This is really the sort of the leadership center, as well as the throat. And he also has a stronger sense of who he is with the ID center kind of on. And then as well too, he has the splenic center switched on. So he's less influenced by other people and by his environment. He's less reactive, and he's much more able to sort of like sense and come from an instinctive place. So it really enhances his judgment in many respects. I think it's really, really interesting. So that will center now switched on by transiting Uranus, which activates the 2551, which interestingly is a channel associated with two things. First of all, with kind of love in the sort of the more universal, compassionate sense, but it's also associated or known as the channel of initiation. And what's so fascinating about it is that it's very often designed, events conspire often when Uranus moves into this position to shock us into spiritual awakening, often through some kind of event that precipitates an ego death. And sometimes this can be through competition. And I do wonder about what happened at that leadership race in 2019, with Boris, whether this was sort of like one of the sort of seminal events that maybe made him potentially maybe rethink a few things. I do think it's interesting, for example, that apparently this happened to his father as well. Like his father never made the sort of the top, like the high admiral of the Navy. He became an admiral, but I think like a rear admiral, and that he felt thwarted in terms of his career, that he didn't get a chance at the top job because of like other people, politics, that kind of thing. And you do wonder with Jeremy whether he carries that signature, that sort of ancestral signature, that wound, himself. And I do think it's interesting that he has lost out. He lost out in 2019, and then he also put himself forward during this last leadership race and didn't really kind of get anywhere. So maybe there is that part of him that sort of wants to kind of prove people wrong, but at the same time, it may also be that those particular events helped him to maybe get rid of personal ambition and really focus on what he can do in terms of making a difference to other people through just being like an ordinary minister or sort of politician, as opposed to the minister, if you like. So it becomes less about, status and power, and more about service. And as I said, that is one of the focuses of that particular channel. So I think that's fascinating. And also I think what's fascinating is that it activates that Uranus stuff that he talked about in terms of he talked about himself as being a firebrand, about wanting to bring about change, and not necessarily being someone who's remembered for being popular, but for someone who's reformed institutions or systems in it, for the good of all. So it may be now that he's more effective in actually being able to do that. So it's fascinating. I mean, I think it's interesting that in the Gene Keys, this particular channel is all about the movement from limitation or constriction on the one hand to acceptance, and then to universal love. So if, say, for example, he took that lesson of his father's career and he sort of moved from this idea of being limited, in other words, like, say, feeling restricted, that he got thwarted in terms of his chances of being like prime minister, and he accepted that and then moved into, as I say, this idea of universal love. What can he still do as a leader to make a difference? Then this brings about a kind of a healing of transmuting a wound into wisdom. So I think it's fascinating, that that all these things kind of come together in his chart. And I do wonder whether, unconscious Saturn, which sits in the 25, so here, and helps to switch that channel on, whether this doesn't suggest that that sort of generational aspect of his wounds, that, as I said, maybe linked to his father since being thwarted in terms of his personal ambitions. And being able to sort of transcend that and to sort of realize, well, you don't necessarily have to be in the top job in order to get things done. Sometimes, it's not the leader who's important, it's actually the team around the leader who are ultimately going to make the difference as to whether something is achieved or not. So learning to be a good soldier in that sense, and not necessarily consider personal ambition. So, I mean, fascinating for me, and I still think someone to watch. I've always thought, that he was the better candidate out of, him and Boris, but clearly, they wanted a Brexiteer. They knew Boris would win them an election, and so that's why he got pipped at the post. But I mean, it's different times now, so it'd be fascinating to see that. And there is already talk about, with his experience, his past experience in government, whether he is more powerful in a way than Liz Truss. So it'd be interesting to see how their dynamic kind of works in the future. But I'll leave that for another time, I think. So that's kind of it. I think this has been quite long, sort of as it is. If you do want to see some of my other profiles, and do by all means visit the Astro Insights blog. I have done some written profiles like this one on Boris, and I've also put links to the video profiles that I've done on people like Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak. So if you're interested in that, then go to blog.astrologysphere.com and check out my articles. But yes, be good to hear your feedback. If you are enjoying these types of profiles, if you want me to do more of them, let me know some suggestions of who you'd like me to do them on in the comments box. But yes, let's see what happens over the next couple of weeks and months. It's interesting times that we live in, very interesting times, and be good to see, if things start to stabilize now.